2011, and I wish both teams in the round the very best. On the motion that this House believes that it is legitimate for states to exaggerate threats to pass unpopular legislation they deem to be in the interest of national security, I invite the Prime Minister to commence the case on side government.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, as the House of the United States of America, we know that popular opinion might be against us when we try to pass proposals which try to increase government autonomy. But we realize that when we are responsible for the protection of our people, ladies and gentlemen, when we have to be accountable to them for their protection and for their lives and for the protection of their mind, body and property, we have to sometimes have a level of discretion, even to hide things and exaggerate things to them, ladies and gentlemen. And that is why we are proud on this side of the House, as the House of the United States, to propose that it is legitimate for the House of the United States to exaggerate threats to pass unpopular legislation. And we have on our side three major arguments. We're firstly going to talk to you about the principle of representative democracy and why it entails a certain amount of discussion. We're secondly going to talk to you about national security and the nature of national security threats, ladies and gentlemen, and the nature of the people and why this is necessary. My second speaker, Sanjay, is going to talk to you about the levels of checks and balances on governments doing this and why it won't be misused, ladies and gentlemen, and why it is necessary in very exigent situations to use this kind of exaggeration. No, thank you. Most importantly, what do we mean by exaggerating threats? We mean sensationalism, ladies and gentlemen. We mean to say that when a couple of lives might be lost, we have to say that we sometimes are forced to say that mass destruction of life and property will result. We have to say that sometimes when we know that there might be a threat of terrorists hiding out in a particular area, we sometimes have to say that there is a mass infiltration of terrorists to our country. So exaggerate it, sensationalize it, and package it in a way that the people will feel that it is really close to them, that the people will feel that it's a really massive threat, even if it is not right now, ladies and gentlemen, as big a threat as you purport it out to be. So that's what we mean by exaggeration. Now let me talk to you about this idea of representative democracy. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that in contrast to direct democracy, representative democracy entails giving an amount of discretion to your rulers, ladies and gentlemen, transferring an amount of power to them to make certain decisions for you. They make decisions for you at several levels. Firstly, they tell you mandatorily to wear seatbelts, ladies and gentlemen, even if you might not want to. So they make decisions for you sometimes, even if you might not want to do it. You give them the power to make those decisions for you, even if you don't entirely agree with them. We also say that particularly relevant is national security, because they have taken the control over national security towards them. They say you can't protect yourself on your own, ladies and gentlemen. We won't give you handguns and we won't allow you to militarily strategize and protect yourself. We take responsibility to protect you. Once that level of protection is infused in the government, once that level of trust is taken on by the government, we say there has to be a level of discretion. There has to be room within which the government can operate to execute their responsibility, ladies and gentlemen. So, what is this in contrast? Sometimes we give them the right to determine our foreign policy, ladies and gentlemen, without us directly deciding. We give them the right to censor certain military information so that we might not make knee-jerk reactions and try and take the mood of take the morale of the country away, ladies and gentlemen. So they're given those rights and we say that's important. But this is in contradistinction to direct democracy. And we'll show you in using the example of California, why direct democracy has yielded really unfavorable results. We say Proposition 13 was something that came out to expand direct democracy. Bylaws, ladies and gentlemen, by elections and citizen legislation were endeavors that came about as a result of Proposition 13 in California. We see massive problems through these things because people don't really think long term, ladies and gentlemen. People only think about the things that affect them, the here and the now. So we have seen this tangible problem in states like California, with people not really thinking about the long term impacts of different proposals, thinking about what they can do tomorrow and really affecting those proposals. So we say we have seen this problem, we need to solve this problem. That's why we need the amount of discretion, at least in terms of national security. So I've shown you representative democracy versus direct democracy. Let me now get into the nature of national security. My second argument. Ladies and gentlemen, we say national security threats are dangerous on multiple levels. Firstly, harms are such that they evolve, ladies and gentlemen. They're not stagnant, they don't remain a particular way all the time. You might foresee a certain harm coming about as a result of a national security threat. It might not be pertinent right now, but people might not understand the type of evolution of harm that can take place. They might not be sophisticated enough to understand the level of development that a threat can take. So you need to sugarcoat it to them and say, this harm might happen to you right now, and this is the big level of harm that can happen to you right now, ladies and gentlemen, for you to come up with a proposal that they might not necessarily like in order to protect them itself. That's the first level of analysis. Secondly, we say that you cannot waste time when it comes to national security, ladies and gentlemen. You can't sometimes have time for massive debates, public discourse, and public arguments, ladies and gentlemen. You sometimes need to impose security checkpoints right now, in the here and now, without waiting for people to decide on it, waiting for people to ascertain the level of discomfort it will cause to them. You need to do it before someone strikes, and that's really, really important. I'll take you in a moment, sir. But we say that that type of exigency demands that you package things and exaggerate things. On a third level of analysis, we say national security threats are so important that if they do strike, a state is gone, ladies and gentlemen. If the impact of a national security threat is massive, the potential impact of it might not be there now, it might come about as a result, it might come about later, it might not be there now, but if it does materialize, it's massive. You're taking away not only the country itself, which is the fountain of all rights and responsibilities to the people, firstly. Secondly, you're saying that if your security structure falls, that shows that you're vulnerable. And in this world of terrorism, we cannot have a situation of vulnerability, a characterization of a country is vulnerable. I'll take you, sir.
In what other instances are you willing to exaggerate certain threats or certain information for interests, like, for example, environmental threat or other stuff?
Yes, we are. We've shown you that it works, ladies and gentlemen. Environmental threats sometimes do work. This is not what this debate is about, but that's an example to prove that this type of legislation works. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that Almo, when he speaks about the environment, exaggerates most of the time. The government of the US doesn't do it, that's not what this debate is about. But when he does exaggerate, the message goes through to the people. They feel that it's real and it's close by. And if they criticize him and say, look, oh, it wasn't really a big threat, then Almo says, well, it worked, you guys did really well, and you counter the threat, ladies and gentlemen. It's great, fantastic. So we say that exaggeration lying works, and that's an example of where it has worked, ladies and gentlemen, to garner mass popular support for climate change, anti-climate change action in the US. Now let me talk to you most importantly about the nature of the people, ladies and gentlemen. And I've spoken to you a little bit about this in my representative democracy argument. We say people necessarily think short term, the here and the now. So when it comes to a security checkpoint, for example, they won't think about the type of threat that will be caused if a security checkpoint was not in place. They'll think about the type of time that it will take for them in the here and now to get to a certain place. They'll think about the level of discomfort that it will cause them, ladies and gentlemen, right now. Because people necessarily are an angry mob. They think short term, ladies and gentlemen. That's why you have a constitution, for example, to get people back to a basis, to get people back to a framework of rights when people are in moments of passion and delusion. Acknowledging that people do have moments of passion and delusion, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why you need a government in the first place. To be disconnected from this passion and delusion and to look at it from a disclaimer opinion. So for all those reasons, we think that the people have vested responsibility within the government. We think that they need a level of discretion to operate freely, and for all those reasons, we are very proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank the Prime Minister for his speech and invite the Leader of Opposition to begin the case on his side of the House.
The clash of the opposition is to say that this policy runs contrary to the principles of a representative government, and it doesn't actually protect people's welfare anyway in their side. First of all, we have to clarify the context, because we think that it's very funny for him to say that the exaggerated threats are, for example, instead of saying 10 lives are killed, you have millions of lives being killed, or there's mass infiltration of terrorists. First of all, aren't this easily disproved by media scrutiny? If you know there are only million lives killed, the international media and the local media would know if it's true or not. That's not the debate, especially if there's mass infiltration of terrorists in your country. We would see it apparently. So this debate is really about future threats that are not really actually apparent to people and more or less not predictable or knowable to people. For example, the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Or for example, terrorist threats growing in terms of cells or sleeper cells in your country. So it's not about mass infiltration of terrorists in their side. But secondly, we don't think he gave an example of an unpopular legislation that we're going to talk about and he wants to defend in his side. Because we think an example of that should be, no sit down, the Patriot Act, where you have the laws of privacy or preemptive wiretapping without court subpoenas. We think these unpopular legislations are unpopular because there's a diminution of rights of people and there's an increased discretion of the government which can lead to corruption or certain monopolies in decision making. But lastly, we think that in terms of the interest of national security, we don't think that you have to do everything in terms of exaggerating threats just to create unpopular legislation because the government thinks this will be able to respond to that security threat more effectively and absolutely in any event. We think that the interest of national security is just to be able to sufficiently predict which threats will come and which threats can we respond to. There's no foolproof or fail-safe security measure anyway. No, sit down. Let's look at this argumentation because the setup wasn't really clear. That's why it's on the merit on their side. First, let's look at the representative democracy argumentation. He says that we transfer decision-making to the government even if we don't agree with it. We think, I'll argue this later more, but for now, we think it's only momentarily. He never argued why it's always permanent. In their side, he will make it permanent because if you exaggerate the threats, then you manipulate the decision and the people cannot really see and hold account this kind of decision-making if it's true or not. No, sit down. Because if you don't agree with the legislation such as Proposition 30 or the Patriot Act, you can be recalled. Your representative can be recalled. Your representative can be pulled out. So we don't think that the transfer of decision-making is absolute even in their side. But secondly, we think that, this argumentation that the state knows better, that's why it doesn't give you arms anyway. We think that there's this false dichotomy between what the state thinks is right and between what the society thinks is right. Because the state is just a representation of society. If the society thinks that guns are not allowed to individuals because they're not rational, it doesn't mean that the state was the one who made it for you because they're more rational. It was also society that told you that, guns are not for you, therefore you shouldn't have it. But thirdly, we think that he says that people don't think long-term impact. First of all, where's the link to this debate? Because we never saw the link in terms of people not thinking long-term. Therefore, they won't support this legislation they think is necessary, such as the Patriot Act, to pass to protect your security interests or whatnot. He gave us this very laughable example of the security checkpoints. If we don't think it's necessary or if we don't think if it's inconvenient, we will abolish all security checkpoints right now. But we still have security checkpoints. That proves that people can suffer inconveniences and will know the long-term impact of security measures and can support legislation if it's actually necessary to protect them in the first place. No, sit down. We think that this fourth argumentation in terms of threats or dynamic, people won't be able to understand how to respond to it, is an assertion. We never heard from him why the people won't understand it. Because, for example, the guerrilla warfare that was done by Vietnams in the Vietnam War, if the government explained it well to the people, they were able to understand that, the Vietnamese use guerrilla warfare. That's why we have to respond to this kind of certain new military adaptive technology or response. But secondly, in my BOI, I asked him, in other areas, a lot of people don't understand certain things, such as environmental, specific policy making, because it's too sophisticated for them. But we don't make decisions for them and exaggerate threats in terms of global warming. We make them understand it. We teach them. If that's his problem, we should teach them. We should teach the people better in terms of making them understand it. But lastly, he goes on to say that there's urgency. We think if it's an urgent threat, because this is not about urgent threats. If it's an urgent threat, if it's real or apparent that knows it down, that Iraq will attack you, that there's a military buildup of Germany, and it will invade the United States, Congress and the executive is already empowered to respond to this by making a declaration of war or by responding to this certain kind of situation. But the people will check it later when the Congress validates that declaration of war with a 2/3 majority. So we think those kinds of urgent situations are already solved right now. I'll talk about why it's contrary to our representative government on two levels, and why consent to pass legislation must be genuine and not manufactured. Before I move on. Okay, let's go to the principles why it's contrary to our representative government. First of all, representative governments want to enable informed choices of people as much as possible. They don't want anyone to lie to you or to mislead you because Because if they lie to you, there's an asymmetry of power in decision making in terms of determining what's better for your interests. For example, a lot of corporate information knows it down. I gave you your chance a while ago. Such as cigarette smoking, the state tells cigarette companies that you will never be able to lie to people in terms of saying, oh, the harms of smoking is not really absolute. You won't really die because of it. We think that the disclaimers government imposes tells you that you cannot lie to your own people. Or for example, my breast milk is absolutely better than commercial milk. We think that this kinds of things in representative democracies will be contrary to this kind of principle. Why are you carving out a special exception to national security when the costs are the same, when the harms are the same, if people are not allowed to make proper information in terms of voting and supporting who the proper representatives are to pass your popular or unpopular legislation in the first place? But secondly, we think that he never proved in this debate that there's sufficient checks and balances if you allow governments to exaggerate threats. Because the principle of a representative government is, okay, you transfer some decision making, but it should not be unilateral assessment. There's a mutual assessment from the people and from these representatives as well. If you exaggerate the threats and you lie to these people, deprive them of certain information that was the truth in the first place, you will not allow the people to able to have that mutual assessment in terms of accountability and checks and balances in terms of, for example, was the Iraq War, should the Iraq War have been done in the first place? We went there were no weapons of mass destruction, and it was only based on the unilateral assessment of Bush's government. But lastly, why shouldn't legislation be passed if the consent is manufactured? Because eventually the costs are absorbed by the people. The rights of this unpopular legislation such as the Patriot Act, you have diminution of rights. Therefore, the people have the right to know what's the truth because they are the ones who will absorb the cost anyway at the end of the day of this legislation. For all those reasons, we are proud to oppose.
I thank the Leader of Opposition for his speech and invite the Deputy Prime Minister to further the case on side government. Here.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, the question today is whether in instances of national security, a danger of a particular sort, which has to be dealt with in a specific amount of time, whether those sort of threats are best countered by giving the government the opportunity, the choice to exaggerate those threats when it feels it needs to do so to pass such legislation. I'm going to first of all deal during my speech with the substantive matter about the existing checks and balances about the credibility issue as delegated by my speaker. After that, in the light of that, I'm going to deal with everything we heard of from their side. So first of all, what do we have on this side of the house to ensure that the accountability structure does not give way, that people don't go out for blatant lies, and secondly, that there is no abuse of the system, that not everything else is dragged into it. We'd like to first point out at a very basic level that there are three main checks in the United States of America which have been proven to work, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, the media in the United States, which they themselves pointed out to, ladies and gentlemen. We say that the media is capable, even if they are not capable in the immediate situation in which legislation is passed to find out these things. In the immediate situation when action is taken, like WMD, they are able to find out in the long-term legislation. And it's very important, sit down. We say that as a result of this, people are given that information in one way or the other eventually. And it does reflect in elections. For example, ladies and gentlemen, after George W. Bush's term, where he lied about the WMD, where he lied about plenty of other things like wiretapping telephones, etc., the Republican Party was handed its largest defeat in years. It was almost a crime to be associated with Republicans. Why is that? Because people found out later, ladies and gentlemen, and they really handed it back to the party of that president. We say that's a large check there. People know that if they use this wrongly, in the United States of America in particular, people are likely to find out about it. And you do have good enforcement mechanisms here. We know that the judiciary is more than capable of dealing with even executive branch officials who carry out these sort of actions. And we say that elections are a good check. But then the question arises, will people ever use this mechanism then if they know it's going to be found out automatically anyway? And that's a good question. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that there are two issues involved in here. First of all, we say that after the fact, say for example that after the fact it's found out, then there is an opportunity because the situation is quite different for the person to justify what he could not justify previously and engage in long debate doing legitimate. We say, for example, if George W. Bush had lied to America and said there is WMD, when later it surfaces that he didn't really know, they go in there and they find out that WMD was there, but he's still dragged in front of a congressional hearing asking him, why did you lie to the people? In that instance, he has a lot of things working in his favor which he didn't have when he thought that Saddam might fire a missile at America. First of all, he has the time, ladies and gentlemen, to explain through a congressional hearing, not to the populace but to a congressional hearing, the exact details, the exact intricacies of the situation. He's able to explain to them that the situation could have evolved, that this was the fear, and he can also explain to them, ladies and gentlemen, that he couldn't take the risk of allowing it to happen. Simple example. People knew, for example, before September 11, that there was a possibility of a terrorist strike in America. But if the president had said, in order to prevent that huge strike with 3,000 lives lost and America looking really vulnerable, we should put checkpoints into every single airport like we do today. You remove your belt, you take off your shoes, you prevent the bombs. Because if you do that, you stop this threat. People would be really angry, ladies and gentlemen. So no one could be able to ensure that sort of security. If they had, it would have been very good, but they couldn't. Say he did that and nothing ever happened in the end, he's dragged in front of a congressional hearing. He can tell them this, he can explain this later. And that's the advantage. You can explain to people better when you have more time, when you can tell them that the situation has evolved. Now moving on from that point, about the checks that are involved, where people can find out if they really want to eventually, and how a person will still use it because he may feel that he can justify it better at that point of time. We say that the threats involved here are very different from the sort they've been talking about. Breast milk feeding and smoking in public have nothing whatsoever on par with the national security threats that we're talking about. September 11th, not really on the par of breast milk feeding. And why is that? There are three main reasons. Firstly, the harms evolve in national security threats. You don't know exactly what's going to come out of this situation. You don't know whether information that Al-Qaeda operatives or known people associated with Al-Qaeda are moving to the United States, where that means another September 11th is going to happen. So that danger is there, it evolves. Secondly, you don't have the time. You don't have the time to explain to everyone in the United States of America, we have all these threats, these people are known, this sort of problem occurred, it could happen, if it happens it's going to be Hollywood. You don't have that sort of time because by the time you finish doing that, you would have boarded the plane and crashed into the World Trade Center. You don't have time. And thirdly, we have a problem of the media in America today, ladies and gentlemen, where you see that it sounds like politics which is used in terms of other opposition parties, where it's very partisan. There is no time for open explanation of all your complex positions in front of the media. They just give the people a soundbite in the television and that's all they get. You don't get to give them the sort of complex argumentation that you can give in front of a congressional hearing, that you can give in the House of Congress. That's why it's a completely different situation which you need to take into account. No thank you, sir. Which is why their characterization of the reasons why people disapprove of legislation is completely wrong. People don't disapprove of legislation because they think, oh, it's diminishing our rights and the government is out to get us, ladies and gentlemen. They don't really have that full information in their hands because the threats evolve, because there is no time for them to ascertain those sort of threats, and because they are not aware, because of the soundbite culture of media in America putting things out, ladies and gentlemen. So we say that it's very hard to make them understand in that sense. Yes.
You're inconsistent. A while ago you were saying that the media is a sufficient checks and balance. Now you are arguing that the media only portrays soundbites. How will that be sufficient checks and balance?
I said in the long run, the media is capable of carrying out this sort of investigation. In the short run, the media puts out soundbites, ladies and gentlemen. As it happens, in the exigencies of the situation, the media does put those things out. But in the long run, we found the media able to carry out that sort of investigative measure which is required. That's not a contradiction. But returning to what they said, well, urgent threats can be read anyway, and this is my rebuttal now. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that there is not a spectrum of either war or no war, and Congress just declares war whenever there's a problem. That's not the point, ladies and gentlemen. There are national security threats when there is no war, which you have to deal with. We say, move in quickly to deal with them, ladies and gentlemen. They said, make them understand. But how do you make them understand when you don't know whether it's going to be the very next day, ladies and gentlemen, that a problem is going to occur? You can tell people about climate change, because climate change has at least 5 or 6 years to come. You can't tell people about September 11th if it's September the 10th, ladies and gentlemen. That's our point here. You need to move in quickly. You need to do this quickly, ladies and gentlemen. So we say the asymmetry of power is required in this instance because of the nature of the threat. It's urgent, it's going to be horrible if it happens, and it's going to cause huge amounts of problems. People can't understand it in that immediate situation. They can deal with it later, they can punish you if you lie, and they can make sure it does not happen again. For all these reasons, give us this power, protect the state, protect the people. Thank you.
Thanks. I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his speech, and I invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to further the case on side opposition. Here, here.
Ladies and gentlemen, I don't ever want to live in a state that side government is going to improve, because we think they're no different from an authoritarian government. They're no different from dictators. This is something I'm going to be explaining in my argument, why this is in fact a tyranny of the state, and how you in fact cripple the people from safeguarding themselves from the very state that swore to protect them. Before I go on to that, let me first start by rebutting the previous speaker, and I have 4 points of rebuttal. First, let's discuss urgency, really, because they tell us that these things are going to happen and people won't know how to respond to them. That in these particular cases, it's extremely urgent, that it's at your doorstep. We think this is something that isn't true, because if it was really at your doorstep, if these threats are so crystal clear, then that means there is no space for government to manipulate facts. That means that these facts are clear, these facts are present, no thank you, and that the media will be there to actually to deliberate this information to the people. People can decide in these cases because the information is there. We're talking about, so we think we're really talking about situations where the information isn't crystal clear, where governments are making subjective decisions because of the fact that the information is not complete. So we think it's unfair for them to say that in the case of President Bush, he didn't know. Because we think in this particular case, you can't exaggerate something you don't know about. So we think it doesn't make sense. So thank you. Secondly, let's talk about why his accountability argument doesn't fly. He first talks about the media. We think there are 2 very different characterizations he brought up. First, he tells us they can counter-check the government because they can find out eventually. But first and foremost, we think, let's concede that's true. But we think in the meanwhile, while these decisions are being made, while the people are looking at these kinds of issues, they don't know. Because of the fact that, no thank you, these media men don't have special information. They only accept what the government tells them, because obviously you're talking about confidential information. So they're not necessarily an equal playing field. They don't have the same information that they can feed the people. So we don't think they are the absolute bastions, or they can counter this. No thank you. But we think, let's look at the idea that, well, they can hold them accountable afterwards. We don't think that's enough, because the damage has already been done. The people's rights have already been robbed. No thank you. And we think in this particular case, there has to be reparation done, and that these things cannot simply be swept under a rug by a simple apology. Third, let's look at this idea, well, President Bush can talk to the Congress afterwards, and the Congress can better understand this later. We think it's not enough, because if you can explain to Congress why these threats could have evolved, we don't understand why you can't explain it to the people. No thank you. These congressmen, no thank you, are like your everyday individuals. They might deal with state politics, but they're not all-knowing. They still have to read the newspaper. They're your average, everyday Americans who represent your people. We think it's the same way that even if people don't understand everything that happens in the course of the state, you still have SONAs so that you can tell them what's happening and let them decide in that particular situation. So we don't understand why it's not feasible in their side. No thank you. But lastly, let's look at this idea. Well, you can prevent the repetition of happening in case abuses happen. We ask, how? Because if your government can just keep on lying to you, if they can keep exaggerating, how are you going to catch them on these kinds of exaggeration? How can you guard against someone who will never tell you the facts straight up? So we don't think those checks and balances are going to stand. With that, let me move on to my argumentation. Yes?
And you never spoke about this tendency of people to think in the short term and the incapacity to digest information regarding national security. What do you have to say about that? What about military censorship, for example?
We think, sir, if you think about it, when you talk about media, we think that if you think about it, the fact of the matter is these people can digest this information if you give it to them. Because the fact of the matter is, if Bush doesn't know everything, we think it's the same way that if people don't know everything, Bush also can't understand everything. You're talking about potentialities. Let's look at their idea, because they said government will act on how they feel. Meaning they're talking about acting on limited information. Because we think threats exist every day. Bombs could happen and go off every day. But governments don't decide to take away your choice or your rights every day because the potentiality exists. We think this is why it's very problematic, because it's very hard to define what exactly urgency is. What exactly is the point wherein you can curtail these rights, where you can bypass the choice of people to decide on these kinds of issues. No, thank you. Because we think if you're talking about bombs or terrorists, they could come today, they could come tomorrow, they could come never, like in the Cold War. It never hit us, ladies and gentlemen. If you think about it, it's so harmful because these states have immense power to bypass a situation when it's convenient. They can bypass your rights when it's convenient for them to do so. We know, ladies and gentlemen, it's very hard to defend your, the choice of people because you have to deal with millions of people. But we think when you talk about the nature of rights, they were never there because they were convenient. They were there because they're what protects you against your state, ladies and gentlemen. We think it's most important for you to have these rights when your stance may differ from the state. Because we think, if you look at it, we already give so much power to the state. They can decide the kind of public curriculum you have. They can impose values through the system. They know where you live. They can tax you and cripple you financially. There's so much power that you already give to the state. But we think there needs to be a line that is drawn. Because we think what happens in this particular case is that you make these individuals puppets of the state. You water down the value of the people's choices and you manipulate them for convenience. And we think this is exactly what authoritarian governments does. Because it's easy to be a democracy when your people always agree with you. Clearly, you'll never have to fight with them. But when they don't, it's how you reconcile with them that actually makes you democratic. Because what does China do? When they're in an inconvenient spot, they censor the media. They tell the people, we're doing this for your own good. They actually bypass these people. And in these cases, the people cannot defend themselves from the state anymore. We think in this particular case, rights no longer exist in their paradigm because it's so easy to say that this is a threat, this is good for you, without letting people decide if this is really true. It's so easy for them to stamp a confidential, top secret stamp on it, and we don't think that's enough. Ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, we think the reason why this information has to be clear and it cannot be skewed is because this is the only way that people can defend themselves from the state, and without that, these people are clearly powerless to defend themselves against the state that was supposed to serve them. With that, we are proud to oppose.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for the speech and invite the government whip to further the case on her side of the House.
Ladies and gentlemen of the House, from the side of proposition today, we're going to be speaking to you on two main clash points. Firstly, in terms of representative democracy, and secondly, in terms of the nature of national security. Now, on the first main clash point, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of representative democracy, and side opposition today has argued that representative democracy does not include the autonomy for governments to make decisions for their people. They've said that this decision-making is only momentary, ladies and gentlemen, and that it does not extend. But we on side proposition today have firmly stood by the fact that representative democracy, in representative democracy, the level of autonomy given to governments in terms of issues such as national security is in fact wide, ladies and gentlemen, and it's wider in scope than side proposition has been trying to prove today. Now, firstly, ladies and gentlemen, they told us that the momentary nature of representative democracy makes it such that you can't in fact give power to your governments to exaggerate a situation situation to you, even if they believe that it is in your best interest. We say, ladies and gentlemen, the periodic elections, we've said this repeatedly, periodic elections will act as a check if the government acts in exercise of their powers, and this is the basis of representative democracy. You elect your representatives into government because you believe that they are compatible, that you believe that they have the capacity to make the right decisions for you. And when is it more important, ladies and gentlemen, for them to make these decisions than when the very life of the nation is at threat? And this is the issue of national security. Now let's look at how they clashed with us on this issue of representative democracy. They told us, ladies and gentlemen, about cigarette companies and how cigarette companies are not allowed to lie on the cigarette packets. Let's look at the problems with this analysis. On the first level, ladies and gentlemen, cigarette companies are not representative bodies. They do not in any way represent the voice of the people. So cigarette companies are in fact arbitrary decision makers in that sense, and the government can in no way, the people can in no way do anything about it. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, what do cigarette companies have to do in terms of national security? We don't even understand the relevance of this example because the topic at hand clearly states that in interests of national security only will governments be able to exaggerate this situation. Now look at the examples that side proposition has shown you, ladies and gentlemen. And we told you that in instances such as drawing a parallel to environmental harms, when Alco actually did exaggerate this situation and did exacerbate it to such an extent, we were able to mitigate the harms that did occur in terms of the environment. Why? Because the lives of people are threatened by these environmental harms. They on their side, ladies and gentlemen, have never in any instance shown us by examples or analysis that any of the instances they have spoken about related to representative democracy tie back to the lives of the people within their country itself. And they on that side have been completely false in this analysis. On the third level, ladies and gentlemen, we say that representative democracy includes the duty of the government to act in the people's best interests, even if sometimes the people do not want it. We spoke to you about seatbelts, ladies and gentlemen. We spoke to you about checkpoints. We told you that sometimes the people have knee-jerk reactions, ladies and gentlemen, and result in inconvenience. They're inconvenienced by seatbelts. They're inconvenienced by checkpoints. They don't see the need for it, ladies and gentlemen. And so they say, we don't want it. But the government with you have elected and put into power by you takes a decision that in the interest of national security, this is in fact important. Now let's move on to the second clash point in terms of national security. And what did they tell us, ladies and gentlemen? They told us, look, why don't you explain this to the people and tell the people about the problems you're having? Because if you can explain it to Congress, if you can explain it to Bush, you can explain it to the people. Now let's analyze this, ladies and gentlemen. Let's look at the nature of national security. And can you divulge everything that you know about national security to the mass of the people? No, you can't, ladies and gentlemen. They've conceded it because they conceded to military censorship. And we know, ladies and gentlemen, that in military censorship, it's done in the best interests of national security, done in the best interests of the people. You recognize that certain information needs to be censored, needs not to be put into the public domain because that information is of such valuable nature that it's important to national security. They said, ladies and gentlemen, look, the people are going to understand this. And we have several levels of analysis as to why the people won't in fact understand this to the extent of which Congress or people within the governmental sphere will understand, and why you have to exaggerate this to the people. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, the nature of national security. And I've already told you that there are certain things that cannot be divulged to the people. Secondly, in terms of the exigency of the situation, in terms of time, we don't have the time to tell everyone about the problem, to explain it to them, and to get it passed. As we said, national security is an exigent issue. And thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of the fact that within the governmental body, you have so much information coming in that you're able to make a perfectly informed decision. But if you recognize military censorship and you recognize that some aspects of military censorship relating to national security cannot be divulged to the large majority at large, then how do you expect them to make the same decisions that you expect the government to make? This is why we have representative democracy, because we recognize that the people we put into government will in fact make the decisions. Yes, ma'am.
Do you believe in the value of having referendums?
Ladies and gentlemen of the House, national security is of such urgency, and we've told you this repeatedly, that on the 10th of September, if we know there's an attack on the 11th, we cannot possibly have a referendum, ladies and gentlemen. This is why we have a representative democracy. You put your leaders in government so that in urgent situations, in instances of national security, they make the decisions for you. If they make a bad call, ladies and gentlemen, you vote them out at the next election. And they said, look, this is too late, because the issue is that the accident has already happened. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we say that if they waited for a referendum, and then in the course of the referendum, a terrorist attack actually did occur, they said, what the heck was the government doing in the first place? They're supposed to act on behalf of us. So we say, ladies and gentlemen, that in terms of national security, they're not really solving the problem of the existing nature of the threats. We say, ladies and gentlemen, if they're saying that who is to decide best what is to be, or who is to make the right choice, is it the people or is it the elected representatives? We say in terms of national security, it's the elected representatives. If you want about issues about public schools, etc., ladies and gentlemen, have referendums all you want. But the nature of national security is such that it requires urgency, and we've proved this, and it has never been disputed by side proposition. We've told you, ladies and gentlemen, that the people act in moments of passion and delusion. The people have knee-jerk reactions, and sometimes we can't afford to take this, because at the end of the day, when something goes wrong, it is the government who's going to be held responsible by the people. The people aren't going to say, you gave us the time to decide, we made the wrong decision. They're going to say, we put you in power, what the heck were you doing at the end of the day? So we say, ladies and gentlemen, on the grounds of representative democracy, on the grounds of national security, on the need to protect the lives of our people, vote for this motion.
I thank the government whip for her speech, and I invite the opposition whip to further the case on her side of the house.
There are two issues that we have to settle in today's debate. The first one is going to be on the role of the state in upholding national security. And I think this is the bulk of the debate, ladies and gentlemen, because essentially this is where the clashes are. But second, we also have to talk about the protection of rights of individuals, which was the argument coming from Deputy Leader of the Opposition, which was never even touched by government whip. So let's go on to the first issue, on the role of the state in upholding national security. Because the way affirmative bench argued in this debate was to talk about the principle of representative democracy, which essentially allows politicians voted in office to make decisions for its constituents, even if their constituents do not agree. The first response to this is that it's absolutist, because these politicians are elected to represent the interests of his constituents, which means that senators or congressmen can't just decide unilaterally on these particular kinds of issues. Because in a lot of instances, ladies and gentlemen, even these politicians go out to the public and get their opinion of their districts or of their states, especially in the United States, where geographic politics is very competitive in each state, which is why it's important for politicians to essentially get the political mood of their state, because it is in their interest of their political parties and of these politicians in themselves to make sure that they get re-elected. And for that to happen, ladies and gentlemen, they cannot completely disregard what their constituents ultimately want when it comes to these particular kinds of legislation. But moreover, that's why this argument of the principle behind representative democracy does not consider even the value of representation. Because essentially what happens is that by its people, it's supposedly to serve as a manner of check and balance against the abuse of power. But now even that check and balance does not exist under government's paradigm. But moreover, the problem is that, well, you know what, it's okay, because sometimes your people don't know. So let's leave the decision to your senators. But ladies and gentlemen, if you're going to take a look at the United States war against Iraq, even your senators and your congressmen were fully informed to begin with. So the question is, even these institutions, your congressmen and your senators, how are they able to make an informed choice even on matters regarding these particular kinds of legislation, ladies and gentlemen? What's the implication of this fact? That number one, the people are not involved, and second, your senators are fully informed. Because essentially, your senators get their information from your executive branch, your CIA, ladies and gentlemen. But this is the executive branch that you're empowering to sensationalize the information that these senators are going to vote on essentially. So what do you disregard under this principle? The right of the people to be fully represented by their representative politicians and the balance of power between these two branches of government, ladies and gentlemen, which is essentially the foundation of any democracy. So what exactly is the kind of government that they're working on their government bench? But second, they talked about how we have to weigh the harms of their policy, of how without their policy, what happens is that people are unable to fully grasp the extent of the threats, and that the harms evolve further or faster than the time it takes to get the consent of individuals. The first response is this: if the people cannot understand, why are you blaming the people by encroaching on their rights when in fact it's the fault of the state because of ineffective information dissemination? But they can't just completely rely on media on government bench, because even media, as they conceded, isn't enough of checks and balances, because sometimes they just give you sound bites. But moreover, even the media's information is fed to them by the state. So essentially, your media cannot fulfill its role of becoming the checks and balances of your people. But moreover, we think that you can't completely rely on them, because essentially, even without the information of your state, some media networks are essentially biased, ladies and gentlemen. So that's why we can't just completely rely on them for our information. But we talked about the idea of how sometimes we allow censorship, like in military operations. We think that military operations are logistical issues for your military. It's different from your legislation, which has a long-term effect on your society and your constituents, ladies and gentlemen, which is blanket across all 50 states of America. Because when they talked about the second harm, how these harms are evolving, it's responded to by our frame, presented to you by leader of the opposition. That's why that harm is irrelevant. Because in the scenario where there is a need to pass unpopular legislation, most likely it's when the threats aren't so sure or real, like there are only tidbits of information that's available. That's why there's still room to argue in Congress. Because if there are immediate threats, like for example, your CIA will say that, oh, there's a plane that's going to crash in the White House tomorrow, then obviously there's no room to pass legislation. Because when you talk about these kinds of decisions, a lot of these decisions require, for example, 2/3 votes of your constitution, ladies and gentlemen, like 2/3 vote of your senators or your congressmen. That's why they don't have enough time. But moreover, that's why there's a check and balance. Your executive has the power to declare a state of emergency so that they can adjust and prepare regardless of a short-term and long-term mindsets of your citizens, which is something that they never responded to, which was the self-correcting mechanism that we told you existed in status quo straight from leader of the opposition. So now let's talk about the idea of their value, because their only value in this debate is that it works in the past. Just because it works in the past, it doesn't mean that it's right, ladies and gentlemen. Because think about it, we could have bombed North Korea instead of having several negotiations with them, and they continue to disregard our laws. But we don't do that because it's not right, ladies and gentlemen. That's why Americans and other nations regret taking on Iraq in 2003. But the worst part under their model is that if we allow sensationalism, there's no way to make your government accountable for the consequences. Especially since there is no limit to how your government can over-sensationalize these kinds of threats that can or possibly be not existing to begin with. Because we think that if this happens, you create distrust in your government as an institution. The question now is, how then is this a well-functioning democracy, especially when you not just disregard the rights of individuals to make informed choices, but you're not even allowing them to rationally choose because you're manipulating their decisions. Because essentially it comes down to the question of the extent of the role of state in national security. We include and allow citizens to participate because in the end, they bear the consequences. And these consequences are usually of life and death. We think that it's better this way because the exclusive value in opposition is that it's easier for people to cooperate in this particular kind of scenario. And that's why ultimately we think we win the first issue. But let's talk about the second issue. When we talked about how it's essentially important to protect rights, we think that number one, we talked about the idea of how rights are essentially there to prevent abuses by the power. It serves as your checks and balance. Because we think that it's not so easy under government model for the state to encroach on these particular rights under the guise of national security, which isn't even quantifiable because we don't know how grave the real issue is to begin with. So in this particular kind of situation, ladies and gentlemen, what then is the use of these rights to begin with if we can't even allow the state to protect it and then give it to these individuals? And we think that because of all these unanswered questions, opposition takes this debate by a mile.
Oh, yeah, one page. Actually. I'll let you know.
the opposition wait for her speech. And I invite the reply speaker to conclude the case inside opposition.
Jesus ran the government. Wait, that's me. We're fine for him to pass any legislation that he wants. Because he only has our best interests at heart and he knows everything. He's omniscient. But when men, even elected leaders and president, and even dumb asses like George Bush, run your government, definitely hell no. We agree, people might not be fully rational, but a million heads will always be better than one person or a few persons, people, making that decision for you and trying to coerce you by creating a manufactured consent to pass that legislation in the first place. The principle we've defended in opposition side is that these decisions must be mutually made and these representative decisions must be able to be reviewed by the people. People will never be able to review those kinds of unpopular legislations if they didn't have the proper information in the first place. Why does government lose this debate from the get-go? Because we think first, they only argue that there are threats and that these threats must be responded to. They apparently forgot the other part of the motion, which were unpopular legislation. They never gave the link why it's necessary to exaggerate it to pass this unpopular legislation. They never characterized what this unpopular legislation were. We gave you that kind of example. But secondly, they never said it's necessary to invade Iraq in the past or that it was necessary to use torture to get Bin Laden. You have John McCain saying we'll never use torture to be able to have that information to kill Bin Laden. But more than that, government side is absolutist. They think that the state is perfect and that the electorate are dumb asses. No, we think we have to be reasonable. More or less, they will be both rational to some extent, and it's better if you have two actors making that decision for you. Again, they never knew where this debate happened because they want to push the idea that this debate happens where there are urgent threats. First of all, if this debate happens where there are urgent threats, there will be no time to pass your unpopular legislations. We talked to you about how, if it's really urgent, you can shoot unidentified airplanes entering your radar airplane zones. The US can shoot it down immediately. The government is already empowered to solve or respond to urgent threats. But even these urgent threats can be reviewed. If you declare martial law, if you pass emergency powers, this has to be reviewed by 2/3 of your Congress and even validated by your people. Secondly, they say in Deputy Prime Minister, a shift in terms of where this debate takes place. Did the President know the threat or not? If the President doesn't know the threat, obviously he'll be forgiven because he never knew the threat. But this debate can't take place in a context where the President or the Executive didn't know what the truth was. Because you can't exaggerate something if you never knew what was the real stuff in the first place. But lastly, we think in terms of the checks and balances or the principal aspect of this debate. They concede by rebutting that the media is a checks and balance. The congressional hearings is a form of checks and balance. They concede to some extent that it raises a problem of accountability. Let's look if they really prove that there are sufficient checks and balances. Because we say, no. First of all, again, there's a Deputy Prime Minister inconsistency in terms of proving why the media can be a sufficient checks and balance in terms of it can educate the people, but later on he says, oh, they only give sound bites. They won't be able to educate or make the people aware. But secondly, if it's okay for them to have this media eventually reveal what was the truth in the first place and what wasn't exaggerated, then the legislation would have already been passed, rights would have already been trampled without it having been necessary in the first place. But secondly, we think that in the short term, okay, they will be fed by the same exaggerated threats that the government is feeding the people. That's why even CNN and not Fox News was fooled by the weapons of mass destruction justification for Iraq. But lastly, this is a fatal kind of rebuttal for them. Because if the truth is there and the hyperbole was revealed, then the people in the future won't be able to trust the government in terms of saying, we have to respond to this future threat, we have to pass this legislation. They are compromising the people's security in the first place. We think that the state alone can't decide what is the best interest always. And it's very important because the people are the ones who absorb the cost. Governments can't wage wars, increase taxes, or reduce rights if it was never necessary to pass that kind of legislation in the first place. For all those reasons and more, opposition goes to quarters.
Reply speaker from side opposition and invite the government reply speaker to conclude this debate.
it's a myriad of various tax figures, the types of legislation, ladies and gentlemen, and types of harms. What is this debate really about? What level of authority do you give your government in terms of national security, in terms of protecting the interests of the country? That's what this debate essentially has been about. And let's analyze that under that theme. So we concede, ladies and gentlemen, that the autonomy you give the government or the transparency and the authority that you transfer to the government is not absolute. That's clear cut. But that's true. But the point of the matter is, when it comes to military issues, when it comes to issues of national security, when it comes to public safety, it's substantial, ladies and gentlemen, a lot more than a lot of other areas that we've been talking about. Why? Because, ladies and gentlemen, the government is responsible for your safety. It's taken over from you, ladies and gentlemen. It doesn't let you regulate yourself in terms of your safety. It even doesn't, for God's sake, let you keep a hand on, ladies and gentlemen. So it's taken complete responsibility over. And I told you this in my first speech. It was never really responded to. This is the principal basis under which we propose this motion. Because government has responsibility, it needs discretion as well. With responsibility, you need rights as well, ladies and gentlemen. You need to operate within a framework where you can effectively protect your citizens. And we say you need a wide framework for that. You need leeway to operate in that framework to protect your citizens. They never engaged us on this fundamental premise which was laid down in Prop 1, ladies and gentlemen. They said that the government was not representative. We say not so. We say when you put that cross on the ballot, you effectively give decision-making power over to those people. We say you give decision-making power and you entrust your long-term decision-making power to those people. You say that they are better placed off to make some decisions than me. I can't, if I make my short-term decisions every day, I might be thinking about the short term, but I give it over to them. I know they know better, ladies and gentlemen. I know they have access to better information. I know they have a holistic picture of the entire country. I know they've taken over my security. I consent to giving them over that discretion, ladies and gentlemen, when I put that ballot in my box. That's why it's representative. And about this issue of military censorship, we use this as an example to show you why in this area of military and public security, a lot of authority is given over to the government. That was only responded to, ladies and gentlemen, in Op 3. I'm not even going to talk to you about that. That shows the level of autonomy, the level of authority that a government has over military issues. We say that extends to telling your people, sometimes exaggerating, blowing things out of proportion, and telling them that there is a threat, when actually the threat might materialize only a lot later, or the threat, ladies and gentlemen, is not as big as you make it out to be. Now, they spoke about urgency, and if it's really urgent, why are you exaggerating? We say that's the nature of national security threats, and I explained this to you in my argument. It might materialize, ladies and gentlemen. It might evolve, it might happen, you might not understand it, ladies and gentlemen. That is what is really important. And the key question is, what if it does happen? That's the question. Look at the harms that are caused when it does occur, when it does materialize, ladies and gentlemen. Look at the types of harms they've shown. Look at the types of harms on our side of the house. The types of harms they've shown are minimalist as opposed to the massive harms that we show in terms of the country's security falling flat on its face, in terms of the country being threatened in terms of terrorism. So we say our harms are massive. We say we need to show and exaggerate and blow those out of proportion. Then they never really rebutted us on the people, about how they are in fact sometimes irrational. They never rebutted us on the example of California. We told you how representative democracy, direct democracy has failed in the United States itself. How we need authority, discretion in the government to use proposals effectively and substantially. That was never rebutted. But let's go on to the key issue of harms. We told you harms will be mitigated through, this was not a contradiction. We said short-term news will be given to the media in the short term. Long-term investigative media happens as well, ladies and gentlemen. Two checks. The courts are a check. Elections are a check as well. If you screw up like George Bush did, you will be thrown out, ladies and gentlemen. That's a sufficient deterrent to make you not lie all the time. We showed you the harms are minimized, but look at the harms if it doesn't happen. We acknowledge, we concede post-facto things happen. And the accountability will take place only after the harm comes about. Conceded. But what if it does not? What if you don't put the security measures in place? What if catastrophe does strike, ladies and gentlemen? That's the question. Those are the types of harms you're balancing out. The type of preventive harm, the type of post-facto rationalization of decisions that have been taken without complete representation and without complete knowledge of the people, and also the type of harms that might come about if you do not do that. Weighing those harms, ladies and gentlemen, we are very proud to propose. Thank you.